This video is meant to accompany the use of sources PowerPoint that's available in our Blackboard site. My idea here is that I can give you sort of an overview of that PowerPoint, which is really meant to be read. As you're going through it, you may find yourself getting a little bit lost. Stick with it, move through the slides, and I think that it will all become clear as you move through it, and you may need to look at it a couple of times. But I think it would be helpful if I gave you just sort of an overview of the important points there. That PowerPoint was actually written by our composition director, Dr. Kenneth Gillum, because remember, giving credit is important. And there's a lot of valuable information there and a lot of very good examples of the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about this week and that I'll be looking for in your writing. It's a little bit text dense, so let's just pull out some of the most important points so you kind of know what to look for as you're going through. We're talking about this week lots of things, but one of them is how you use the sources. You've been doing in projects 1 through 3 a lot of gathering information, establishing context, establishing counterarguments, looking at sort of the field and what people are already talking about. What you want to do now as you begin to think about Project 4 and making your own argument is how best to put all of that to use. So essentially, as you'll see as you go through that PowerPoint, there are 3 sort of main purposes that you can use your research and your sources for. And those are to establish facts, establish theory, and then to place you, the writer, in the middle of the conversation, to give context and let the reader know where you fit into the conversation that's already going on. Now, as you'll see, you'll get lots of examples of why those things matter, but as you're reading, as you're thinking about this, remember a few things. One of them is that you are making an argument, and I know we've said this quite a bit, but it is your position, your argument. The sources that you're using are the sources that helped get you to your position and get you to the conclusion that you've drawn. Now you're sharing your conclusion with the reader, and then you're using your sources to convince them that your conclusions are right and that your points are right. And I'm making that point again to say, remember, your sources are your backup for your voice, your argument. That means you want to avoid one of the common mistakes that a lot of people make when they're beginning to write, especially as you're learning to make an academic argument, and that is thinking that your source should make the point for you. Remember, it's yours, which means you should begin every one of your sections of your paper, maybe even every paragraph, with your words, not with a quote or with something that you've drawn from another source. You've got a point to make. That should be what the reader sees. Then bring in all of the research that you've done after you've made that point, just to back it up and say, hey, I've got all this evidence to support what I just told you. But it is yours to say. That leads us to another related and common mistake, which is to think that, quote, the facts speak for themselves. Facts almost never speak for themselves. Facts are there to help support a conclusion that you've drawn. We talked a lot last week about subjectivity versus objectivity and how you can't make an argument that isn't subjective, that isn't an opinion, that isn't somehow a conclusion that you've drawn. Facts are just evidence. So think of your sources as, and the PowerPoint makes this point too, the evidence that you're going to bring to trial with you as a lawyer. You've got a case to argue, you need to make that clear to the reader, and then you need to just call, after you've made your point, Exhibit A, and then bring it forward, and then Exhibit B, and then bring it forward. As you do that, remember, just like you would, to continue with that courtroom analogy, remember, in a courtroom, or in a court of law, or in the court of public opinion, that evidence is going to be subjected to all kinds of scrutiny. How reliable is it? How credible is it? How credible is the source? How credible are the sources that your sources used? Because often you're going to be reading arguments that cite other people's research. You need to think about how much people will need to know about that source and how much scrutiny they're going to subject it to. So be sure that you're using the best possible evidence and that the sources that you're citing have also used the best possible evidence. You need to be just as critical of those sources as your readers will be of you in your argument. So as you're working, remember, this is all there to help you become more persuasive to an audience that may disagree with you, to an audience that is going to ask that you have good sources and that they know where to find it. If you have any questions as you're working through that PowerPoint or as you're working through designing your own argument, framing it, next week we're going to be working on that some more. Please shoot me an email and let me know. And also remember, you're joining a conversation. That's a conversation that has been going on long before you joined it. It'll go on after you've joined it and made your contribution. Essentially, you're just trying to establish where you are in that conversation, that you are part of the conversation, that you have read and listened to other people who've been talking about your subject, and that you're ready to then present that information to other people and bring them in too. It sounds like a lot to do, but again, the only way to do it is just to practice and to get some feedback. Again, if you have questions, email me, and I'll look forward to seeing the results.